Welcome to Conversations from St. Norbert College, a program that encourages discussion in our community on today's local and global issues. Now your host for Conversations from St. Norbert College, author, professor, and nationally known sports economist, Dr. Kevin Quinn.
Welcome to Conversations from St. Norbert College. Our special guests today are Michael Kimmel and Michael Kaufman, two masculinities experts who are visiting St. Norbert College's campus this semester. Welcome to the program.
Good to be with you. Nice to be here.
And welcome to St. Norbert College.
Thanks.
So I'm going to ask first of both of you, what is masculinity studies? How do you define that?
Want to go for it? Okay.
No, go for it.
Well, masculinity studies is very simple. It is it's the study of how we understand what it means to be a man in different cultures at different times among different groups of people. So we don't even talk about masculinity in a singular way anymore. We talk about it in the plural, like masculinities, because we understand that just because we make masculinity visible doesn't mean we make race or class or ethnicity or sexuality or age or religion or region or any of those other things that shape our identities invisible. So we talk about all of these different masculinities. And we look at it, masculinity studies looks at it from the perspective of every discipline that you have. So there are biologists and endocrinologists, and as well as media studies people talking about the representation of different groups of men in TV or movies or in literature, and then if there's social scientists who are actually looking at behaviors and attitudes.
And how did each of you get interested in this field? I mean, I like to think about how popular culture may have defined what it meant to be masculine through World War II and through the baby boomers and all that stuff. So how did each of you get interested in this?
I think for me it was a long process that goes back to the 60s as I was growing up in a family with a strong and loving father and a strong and loving mother, and 4 sisters, and an assumption that we were all equal. And for me, it also happened in the context of moving to North Carolina in 1960, and in the midst of racial segregation. And my parents taught us all a really important lesson from the start. They said, we're not going to any of the segregated restaurants, movie houses, bowling alleys, basically everywhere. Because if everyone can't go, we're not going to go. Now, as a 9-year-old kid, you're thinking, I just want to do things with my friends, why can't we go? And they just said, no, we're not going to go. And that began to teach me that we have to define our own values in solidarity with others. It's not just about our own interests, it's about our interests within a larger community. So it began to teach me not just supporting other people, but seeing myself within the struggles and the aspirations of other people. And so fast forwarding 10 years or so, by the time I reached university in the late 60s, that was the beginning of the modern women's movement. And all of my friends, I know for Michael too, our women friends were feminists, were active in the women's movement. And so just gravitated there naturally. But it was interesting for me anyway. As a man, I knew there were certain things I wasn't supposed to say. I knew there's things I wasn't supposed to do. But I hadn't really thought about all these issues in relation to me as a man. And in fact, it was strange. I just assumed that I must be the only man on the planet who didn't fit into all the expectations of manhood. I must be the only guy who wasn't always, confident, or wasn't always fearless, or wasn't always strong, or wasn't always in control, or, you could just keep going with the list of things we're supposed to be. And it wasn't until the late 70s, in my case, that I started doing some training in peer counseling, ended up in a men's group, and suddenly heard from other men who seemed to fit right into our stereotypes of manhood. I heard the same thing from them that I'd always been feeling. That was the expectations that were placed on us, that we placed on ourselves, were impossible to live up to. So I began a process of thinking about my life as a man in relation to the important and very real concerns that feminist women had raised, and trying to think about the ways that we had defined men's power not only brought us power, not only brought us privileges and more pay and on, but actually exerted a cost on us as men. And so just started thinking about the lives of men.
You know, that's interesting you should say that, because you know, I've taught a course here in the economics of gender and family, and you know, a lot of it is just sort of a trip down the data there.
Right.
But it made me more sensitive, I think, to what, you know, the Mad Men era was about. You know, in our parents, there was a lot of pressure on, you know, mom to be the perfect homemaker and all this other stuff, because that was what the culture was pushing. And we've thought a lot about that in the last several generations, but there was a lot of pressure on dad.
Sure.
You know, that you had to provide this lifestyle, and you were there by yourself thinking about how you were going to do that. So you also had a journey that actually began at Vassar, if I'm not mistaken, right? Not long after they became co-ed.
It's around the same time. I mean, there's really two different questions here. How did I become interested in masculinity studies? And how did I become interested in this larger political movement? And how did feminism as a political movement touch me? The answer to that question is really sort of to flip it. It seems to me that the wrong question to ask is, how did you become a man who supported feminism? The right question is, how come everyone doesn't? I mean, we've never met yet before, Kevin, but I would say this to you. You know, feminism is really very simple, right? All it requires is that you make one empirical observation and take a moral position based on that empirical observation. Being an economist, here's the empirical observation. Women and men aren't equal. Do you share that?
I think that's pretty clear.
Okay, and here's the moral position, and they should be. You share that?
Sure.
You support feminism. It's really that simple. All that other stuff is just fluff. It's irrelevant. That's what it comes down to. So as a person, as a citizen, of course we support gender equality in the same way that we support racial equality or sexual equality, because it's right and fair and just, full stop. You don't need any other motivations. You don't need to be different. That's all it takes. Best example of this, by the way, is his prime minister. We should be so lucky. The Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau, was elected in 2015, and he says, I'm going to name half of my cabinet as women. And everyone went, oh no, you know. And so what happened? He names half his cabinet women. He's at a press conference, and someone said, why did you do that? And do you remember what his answer was?
No.
Because it's 2015. Period. End of story. Right? So that, it seems to me, is the political part. And every one of us would have a story. And you too. There's a moment where we have, you know, feminist women talk about this click experience, this moment when you realize that what happened to you didn't just happen to you, it happens to a lot of other people. That is to say, it's systemic. I think we guys have the same thing. There was a moment in Michael's life, in my life, and I bet in yours too, when some woman told you what happened to her, and you didn't answer, what were you drinking, what were you wearing, why were you at that party, etc. But you answered by saying, wow, that's really wrong. What happened? And you know who's facilitated those kind of conversations everywhere? You know, Anita Hill, 25 years ago.
I was thinking about that on the way into work this
Donald Trump. He is the Clarence Thomas of our moment, right? There are women all over this country who are telling their husbands, their children, their parents, their boyfriends, that what he's talking about, that happened to me, right? So at some point we say, wow, that's really wrong. I had no idea. But now you do. Now you have an idea. Now you have to do something about it. So our political position is really based on nothing more than a simple observation about how the world works. Nothing complicated or mysterious about this, right? So you don't get a medal for this. You're a citizen. Of course you support this. You live in this country. That's what our principles are. Now, how we get interested in studying it is something that Michael said, which is, okay, there's this massive movement out there, and we guys are sitting on the sideline saying, oh, that's interesting that those women are doing all that stuff. Has nothing to do with me. And we then enter that conversation by saying, my God, as Michael said, it has everything to do with me. It has everything to do with the kind of expectations, like you were saying, the Mad Men era, the books that came out about the psyche of the Don Drapers, you know, the man in the gray flannel suit, the organization man, the man who was other-directed, not inner-directed, had no moral compass, just did what everybody told him to. He was empty and lonely. That was the psychological analysis of these guys. We grew up inheriting that, saying, I don't want to be empty and lonely. I don't want to just be a wallet. That's not the organ by which I nurture my children. We want something else. And so we said, wow, the feminist women are right. Masculinity is a problem for men too. We've got to start thinking about this. And fortunately, this is the masculinity studies part, fortunately, there's all these kinds of theoretical perspectives already out there that will help us. There's feminist theory, there's queer theory, there's multicultural theory. This is what we use. These are the methods that we use to understand our position.
You know, I was thinking as you were saying that, back to the great battle of the sexes, the Bobby Riggs, Billie Jean King thing. And I think that was a moment of clarity for a lot of guys in the generation before us, because they, I think, assumed that their wives were going to be, rooting for Bobby Riggs, and found out that that was not the case.
You know, Billie Jean keeps talking about that day. It changed American history in some way. And she said, "Can you imagine what would have happened if I lost?" Right? Everything they were saying would have taken like 20 more years for people to not believe it.
You know, that was in some ways the ultimate 70s moment. It really was. Just everything that went around that, et cetera. Well, you said something a minute ago that made me think about something you'd written in a book that you did in the early 90s, which was, I'm guessing, pretty early in the days for this. Let's see if I can get the book right here. Cracking the Armor. And you talked about your own journey of not quite feeling that you were the same as all the other really masculine guys, only to find out that, wow, they're all going through this. They've all had this first moment of humiliation and all that sort of thing. So how was that received at the time? I mean, that was pretty early in the days of what we would think about this field, right?
Well, and when we were first writing, it was actually in the mid-'80s when both of us were first publishing in this field. And it was seen as pretty weird. You know, there were a lot of women who, our colleagues, who wondered, you know, why are you wasting time talking about men? I mean, aren't they the problem? And I think, and I think for many men there was at first there was just suspicion. You know, oh, you're just crapping on me, or whatever it might be. But the exciting thing, and I think we both felt this from the start, is when we were in situations where we were able to just sit down and talk with other men, there was a sense almost from the start that men had waited their whole life to be able to talk about these things, to hear about this, to understand their experiences, as Michael said, that they weren't alone. And importantly, though, to link it to this, to this broad social and intellectual movement that we were all hearing more and more about, which was the women's movement, which was modern feminism. So it was both a challenging time. You know, both of us do a lot of work in the United Nations. There wasn't much space for us back in the 90s, even into the 2000s, in those institutions and governments and business, and that's changed now. That's changed dramatically. I think all over the world, there are people, there are men and women who are just very strongly feeling that we've got to figure out ways to reach the men.
You're involved with the White Ribbon Movement, right? And then the National Organization of Men Against Sexism, right? So talk about those groups and how they've grown. I mean, everyone knows about the National Organization of Women and other kinds of groups that are identified as being feminist. I'm not so sure that these two groups I just mentioned have the same kind of profile. So talk about what that's all about.
Talk about the White Ribbon.
Yeah, the White Ribbon campaign, it was something that three of us started in 1991 in Toronto, where I live. And it was three men. We felt two men who approached me, and they'd been challenged by their wives. And their wife said to them, "You guys don't use violence in our relationship, but why aren't you speaking out against it? Why are we living in a world where men are not speaking out against men's violence?" So we started this was before Ribbons for Everything. It was the same year that the Red Ribbon for AIDS started. And we started just a very simple idea that men should speak out against violence against women. We should look at our own behaviors, our own attitudes, because we know that the majority of men in Canada, where I live, here in the US, don't use violence in their relationship. They don't commit sexual assault. They don't hit their wives. They're not emotionally abusive. I'm not saying we're all wonderful and sweetness and light all the time, but we're not. Most of us are.
Yeah, we kind of are.
Well, we kind of. The three of us are.
We
are.
Yeah.
Well, I understand some guys I know, but but we're not. The majority of us are not abusive. But because of the silence of the majority of men, we've allowed the violence to continue. So it was a simple idea. It spread across Canada. And since then, the White Ribbon Campaign has spread to, we think, 80 or 90 countries around the world. I say we think because we started it as a totally decentralized movement. We didn't want to have an organization as such. We just wanted men and boys to do what they could do in their own communities. And we believe strongly that the men and women in their own schools, in their own workplaces, in their own places of worship, knew best how to reach the men around them. They knew not only the literal language, but they knew the cultural language that people spoke. So if I was, being here at St. Norbert, I'd be speaking about mutual esteem. I'd be talking about respectful dialogue. And so using the cultural language of our community, of your community in this case, to make connections with issues around ending violence against women. So it's been exciting to see that develop around the world, including some campuses here in the United States.
You asked a question about the activism part, and my career I'm university based. I teach in the State University of New York system, and I've always been an activist both, and I've tried to maintain both a foot in each of those camps. My activism started before in the late 1970s. I was finishing my PhD, and I started a group in Santa Cruz called Santa Cruz Men Against Rape. And it was because the people in my life were involved in the Santa Cruz Women Against Rape, and they were talking about what it meant. And I thought, well, this is odd. The whole conversation seems to be taking place by women. And here's why I was set up for that. My involvement I did not go looking for this. This found me. My dissertation, which I'm sure you've read, is on 17th century French tax policy.
Yeah, it was huge.
It was huge. I know.
Wisconsin.
It was really big. I know. I got a really nice letter from Paul Ryan about it because he loves tax policy.
Yes.
But while I was doing my partner at the time was doing her dissertation on the first shelter for battered women in the Bay Area, in the San Francisco Bay Area, and we had one car and it had a stick shift, and she didn't drive the stick shift. And that's the reason I do this, because what happened was when women called and said, I need to go to the hospital, I need to get my kids out of the house, I need to go to the shelter, I drove them. And let me tell you, Kevin, it changes things when it touches you, right? When it's not some abstract statistics, but when it's sitting in your car and a woman says on the way to the hospital through a broken jaw, sometimes I deserve it, but this time I didn't. And it rips you apart. And so I said to my partner, I'm tired of the 17th century French tax policy. I want to come work at the shelter. You're doing amazing work. And she said, well, you can't do it. And I said, what do you mean? And she said, look, the shelter's for women. The only reason you even know where it is because I can't drive the stick shift. She said, I have a good idea. Why don't you go talk to the men who beat the women up? And I looked at her like, it was one of those Mars-Venus moments, like, are you kidding? I don't want to talk to them. They beat women up. I want to talk to the women. And she said, and you know how someone will say something, now this is like 40 years ago. This woman said to me, and I can still hear her inflection, exactly as she said it. She said, you have a natural constituency of half the human race. Go talk to them. I thought, okay, she's right. So I went and found a group in San Francisco that was working with court-mandated batterers, and I was trained to work with them in batterers intervention groups. And that was my introduction to this politics. All the while, I was maintaining a kind of academic career. So what I want to say is that my activism has informed my academic research. And my academic research has also changed my activism, because it has to be, as both of us are social scientists, it has to be evidence-based. You can't just sort of fly off and sort of say stuff. Well, if you're a presidential candidate, you can, but most of the time you can just fly off and say stuff.
Yeah, as an economist, we can say stuff and then go look for the...
And then you say, oh, well, I assumed this.
Yeah, exactly. Well, the two of you did a book together that I had an opportunity to look through, and I kind of chuckled about, A Guy's Guide to Feminism. Right. So talk about where that came from and what that experience was like what's it like to write a book with another person? I've never done that. You seem friends, so it seems like it worked out okay.
We've been really close friends for 35 years, so we're good with that. Yeah. Plus, I have to say that one of the things that's really important, because this work that Michael and I do is so earnest and serious. We're talking about violence against women. we're talking about discrimination. And if you can't laugh at yourself, if you can't maintain some kind of sense of humor, you are lost. You will burn out immediately. It won't take long. So our humor like feeds off of each other, and it enables us to sort of keep going in a way. So we've been looking, we've written things together, we've edited things together, but we thought, like, let's do this one together.
Just have fun. I think both Michael and I have had experiences where we'll visit a university campus or a community, and some student group or student staff group will hand us a pamphlet that they've put out on dating violence or on equality issues. And I mean, we're both reasonably smart people. We've got PhDs, and I don't know about you, but I can barely read some of these things. I mean, it's so, I'm not making fun of people for doing it, but what I think we both felt in writing this book is that we wanted to communicate with people. We didn't just want to say the right things or show that we had this wonderful analysis of the issues, but we wanted to be able to connect with young men. We wanted to be able to connect with men in whatever that sort of 16 to 25, 30 age range in particular. And so what it meant is to try to boil down some really complex arguments, ideas, history, and put it into not just bite-sized but accessible language. Now, there's some entries in that book when we talk about men's violence. There, of course, there's not a joke in sight, but there's other things where we're able to make it fun and engaging.
The idea was really very simple. It was basically what we were talking about before. Feminism, like, okay, guys, I know that you think this has nothing to do with you. And if it does have anything to do with you, it's because they hate you, they're angry at you, they're screaming at you. So let's boil this down to just a few things that feminist women have identified as the issues they're talking about. And we have these very short, bite-sized entries, and they're alphabetical. So we start with things like, what is the word ally or anger? Like, because men are very afraid, for example, that women's anger at inequality is actually that they hate men personally. Like, so we want to separate those two. Anybody would be indignant and angry about being the victim of discrimination. Anyone. So we want to say, yes, they're right to be angry, and don't worry, it's not about you. So we tried to do it in a way that would be super accessible and therefore kind of fun to read, right? Because most of us approach this topic like saying, oh God, they're going to make us feel bad. We're going to be blamed for everything. I didn't rape anyone, that kind of thing. And it feels to me like if your entire way of coping with the question of feminism is to take the individual opt-out option, like I never raped anyone, this isn't about me, you've set the bar way too low, right? I think we can do a lot better. We can understand what it is that women have been talking about. So we tried to distill it as we understood it, right? As men, we tried to distill it so that we could present it to other men.
You did a book a few years back that made a big splash, Guyland.
Yeah.
And I remember actually reading about it in the press at the time. It made an impression on a lot of people. And so, what is Guyland? And is this the same thing as the bro code, the bro culture?
Well, Guyland is actually basically tries to respond to what I regard as something that's really interesting on college campuses specifically, which is there's a new stage of development. We'll start there, because if you look at what the Mad Men era, people got married when they were 21. They committed to careers at 21. The average age of marriage, in 1950 was 20.4.
That's
so
crazy.
I know, right? And today it's 28.3. It's taking us a full decade longer. So I wanted to map that new space, that new transitional era between adolescence and adulthood. You could call it adultolescence. You could call it emerging adulthood. There's a lot of other ways to talk about it. But I decided to gender it and talk about Guyland because here's the dilemma that I found. And I'm sure Michael saw this also. You go to a college campus and by day, in your class here, by day, there's no more gender equal place in the United States than the college classroom during the day. Everybody's dressed the same. They all know how to gender their pronouns. They say politically correct things. They say he or she. I mean, they know how to speak. At night, completely different. And as a social scientist, you can see power by who dresses up for whom. So by day, the students are all dressed the same, right? They're wearing sweatshirts or jeans, flip-flops or running shoes, t-shirts or sweatshirts. At night, the guys are still dressed exactly the same, and the girls are all wearing like dresses and makeup and heels. At night, it is a completely gender unequal world. Here's this place that, so I wanted to try to figure out, like, what happens when the sun goes down? What's going on for these young people on college campuses? So the original idea of the book was to try to figure out, that out. And what I came to was to understand what kinds of pressures, you were talking before about the pressures on the Don Drapers, the dads. What kinds of pressures exist for these young men to prove their masculinity in a world without grown-ups? Because they've been helicopter parented before they get here, and then we just basically go, you're on your own, you're grown up.
Welcome to college.
Welcome to college. And the book itself is really a catalog of what young men do to prove that they're real men to other guys. Because that's what we're doing. We're proving it to other guys. You have 18-year-olds on college campuses trying to prove that they're real men to 19-year-old guys on college campuses. So there's a chapter on binge drinking, on hooking up, on video games, on sports, on sexual assault, on fraternity initiation. That is, it's a catalog of all the arenas in which guys are trying to prove their masculinity.
Well, one of the things I found was that at the beginning of the book, you pick, I don't know, half a dozen or 8 different guys of various ages that are actually out of college, you know,
right?
And it's kind of a dismal setup for, you know, wow, that guy's 26 years old, he plays video games, he's got no hope for a job, no interest in a job. I mean, it seemed like a permanent adolescence that was not necessarily mirrored among females of that same age.
Yeah. Well, I have to say, when the book first came out, I got hundreds of emails from women around the country saying, "Why did you stop at 26? The guys I'm dating in my early 40s, they're right there." So you know, so maybe, you know, Father of Guyland or Older Brother of Guyland, which should be the next book. But what I found there is that because we don't have any kind of clear demarcation between youth and adulthood, these guys were kind of making up these rituals as they went along. And so here was the dilemma that I was being offered by my colleagues around the country. They would say to me from other colleges, they would say, the women in our classes are so much more focused, so much more goal-oriented. Why? Because they're working backward. They're counting backward from how the reproductive window begins to close. So they say, okay, I know I want to have my first kid by 28 or 29, which is what they'll say. All right, so if I want to have my first kid by 28 or 29, I have to have the serious relationship by 26, which means I have to have my career going by the time I'm 23. They have it all planned out. The guys are drifting, saying, it's all good. I'm going to live to my 90s. I don't have to, like, rush. And so part of it was they were drifting out of college, and what I did was I followed a bunch of guys who had graduated from one Ivy League school, and they all moved to Boston together. There were 7 guys living in a 2-bedroom, 2+ bedroom apartment. And they were basically trying to have, you know, kind of like drifting into adulthood. One guy eventually said, you know, my girlfriend wants to get married, so I'm going to move out. And the other guy said, you know, if I keep going out to the bar every night and drinking, my boss is going to fire me. So he moved out. Another guy said, all right, guys, I've been here for 3 more years. It's been great, but I'm going to go to law school. He moved out. Gradually, we drift into adulthood without any plan. You know, don't you notice this about my students are constantly, like, they don't know how to build a career ladder, you know, from rung to rung. They walk out of college and they think, all right, I'm going to be CEO, CFO. If that doesn't work out, you know, I'll get another job where I'll soon be CEO. They have no clue how to build that kind of plan.
Yeah, I can appreciate that. You know, my own experience here at St. Norbert is that the students come in and the female students tend to be more serious about their studies, more disciplined, etc., and the young men drift a little bit. But something happens between junior and senior year, and it's like these are not the same guys.
Well, something clicks, right?
Something,
like, oh my God, I better get serious.
This half hour went by very, very quickly. So thank you very much for visiting St. Norbert College and sharing with us your ideas. And thanks to all of you for joining us today, too. Until next time, best wishes for good conversations from St. Norbert College.